Good morning, subscribers, and welcome. Today I am looking at the trade creation and trade diversion effects of a customs union. And how appropriate is it, ladies and gentlemen, that we should be looking at this at the moment when we are, of course, now moving into the next stage of the United Kingdom's departure from the European Union. So it's very apt and very appropriate. You'll find this, ladies and gentlemen, obviously on the A-level economics syllabus specification, and it's something that I've been looking at and will be looking at with my students in the next few weeks. So just a little background first of all, ladies and gents. This is obviously all to do with the notion of economic integration. Now that can be in the form of economic, political, monetary integration. And we have been looking in recent times at free trade areas. Now you'll know there is a difference between, for example, a free trade area, so-called, and a customs union. The European Union being an example of a customs union, and NAFTA, the North American FTA, free trade area, being an example of a free trade area. So let's consider the free trade area very briefly by way of background. Free trade area, NAFTA, great example, made up of Canada, United States of America, Mexico. Now, what does a free trade area entitle those member nations to do, and what happens as a consequence? Well, if you think of Canada, it's a great example, this one, because geographically they're all very close in proximity. So if we say, here we have Canada, here we have United States of America, and here we have Mexico. Okay, so three geographically located countries in close proximity. So what does the free trade area mean in this case? So what it means is that the countries agree to remove barriers to trade between one another, so between Mexico and the United States, Mexico and Canada, etc. However, they retain the right to implement their own trade barriers against non-member nations. So for example, China, United Kingdom, any country which is not one of these three. So if, let's say, it was tyres coming from China, for example, Canada might have an import duty and an import tariff, let's say, of 10%. The United States might want to have one of maybe 50%, and Mexico might have one of, let's say, 30%. Now, that's all very well in theory, but in practice, I'm sure you can see the problem here. If these countries can trade freely with one another, with the absence of tariff barriers, well, what's any sensible individual going to do who wants to bring, let's say, tyres into the United States? Well, what they will do is they will go to the lowest tariff country, so which is Canada in this instance, bring the tyres into Canada, and then of course once they're in Canada they can be freely shipped around between these three countries, and so you can easily get them into the United States and avoid this 50% tariff. And so that, ladies and gentlemen, that is known as trade distortion. And this type of setup, this type of free trade arrangement creates this distortion in trade, whereby you'll find that goods are channeled in via the lowest tariff country and then distributed from there. So that's a bit of a problem with the free trade area. So how does a customs union, such as the European Union, how does it attempt to get around this type of problem? So you'll know that we, of course, in the United Kingdom, are members of, this is Europe, ladies and gentlemen, we in the United Kingdom are members of a customs union. And what does that mean? Well, it means that we have free movement of goods, services, capital, labour between ourselves and France and Germany and there are 28 member states at the moment, as you know. There'll be 27. Indeed, the 27 are meeting today, aren't they, to discuss Theresa May's progress in the last week or so. Unfortunately, Theresa May not entitled to be in that little meeting. But it means that we can move around freely and goods can come and go freely. So there are no tariff barriers between member nations in the same way that we have here in a free trade area. But the distinction here is that the customs union has also a common external tariff. And so around the European Union's 28 member states, we have a common external tariff. So rather than having different tariff barriers, we have common external tariffs. And that, of course, is supposed to alleviate this problem of distortion of trade, because there is no advantage to bringing goods in one area rather than another, at least not in terms of the charges, in terms of import tariffs and all of that jazz. So that's what your common external tariff is. Now, we, of course, are in the thrust of removing ourselves from this, and who knows what the likely trading arrangements will be, whether or not we will have a very hard Brexit, in which case we will have maybe quite significant trading barriers, or a soft Brexit, in which case we won't. Time will tell on that one. But what I want to look at with you today, by way of this diagram, and it is quite a complicated diagram, is this whole notion of how trade is created and distorted and diverted simply because of implementing and becoming a member of this thing called the customs union. So you may, I'm sure you know that the UK joined the customs union of the EU in 1973. And so what I'm going to look at here today is the position before membership of the European Union, and then the position after, and what these trade creation and distortion effects actually are. So here we have our initial diagram, ladies and gentlemen, and we're going to assume that this is for the United Kingdom. So we have the demand, the domestic demand, so the demand in the United Kingdom for a particular good, and we have the supply, the domestic supply for a particular good. We have here the equilibrium point, which would imply in this case that you're just using you're just buying your own goods produced in your own economy, and so there's no trade taking place. And I'm sure you're probably familiar with the term autarky as the no trade position. So I'm going to use an often quoted example here, which is to do with the import and export and the production and purchasing of lamb, as in the animal. Okay, now a few scenarios to start off with, ladies and gentlemen. This is the domestic demand and the domestic supply, and this is hence the price that we can produce lamb in the UK. Now, before 1973, we could bring lamb in from the world's most efficient producer, and that was New Zealand. And the New Zealand price of lamb, ladies and gentlemen, was way down here. Okay, New Zealand. Or a near neighbour, our French friends, just across La Manche, we could perhaps have traded with them. So they weren't as efficient as New Zealand, and the French price was about here. Prix France. Okay? Now, because this is before we joined the European Union, that meant that goods coming from New Zealand were subject to a tariff, and goods coming from France were also subject to a tariff. Now, in the case of France, I'm going to say that when the tariff was implemented, the price of a good, or the price of a lamb coming from France, was PF plus T, so PF plus the tariff, so equivalent to what we could do ourselves domestically. And the price from New Zealand, I'm going to say, ladies and gentlemen, was PNZ plus T, which I'm going to put here, right here. So that's PNZ plus T. Okay? So, let's have a look at the trading position here to start off with. We can either buy from France or New Zealand? In this instance, we're going to buy from New Zealand because, in spite of the tariffs, it's still cheaper to bring the goods and services in from New Zealand. So we're going to buy from New Zealand at this price, PNZ plus T. Now, let's consider domestic supply and domestic demand at this point. Domestic suppliers, so we're looking at all the points on the supply curve, domestic suppliers can compete right up to this point here on the domestic supply curve. So all these domestic suppliers here, all the way down, they can all compete up to that price. But of course, domestic demand at PNZ plus T is actually here on the demand curve. And so that means, ladies and gentlemen, that the distance between this point here, so we're going to call this, this is our QD at the New Zealand plus tariff price. That is the domestic supply, rather, not the demand. That is obviously less than the demand, which is QD NZ plus T. And so we have more demand than supply. And as a consequence, that distance would obviously have to be imported. So that would be M, that would be your quantity of imports. So that's it, ladies and gentlemen. That's what we're saying happens before 1973 when we buy from New Zealand. Okay, 1973 comes along and we join the European Union. What happens then? Well, this is what happens as a consequence, ladies and gentlemen. The tariff, let's just say, with New Zealand remains. So we still have to pay a tariff from New Zealand. However, the tariff with France now disappears because, of course, we join the customs union, and so the tariff is removed. And so actually now we can buy from France at not PF plus the tariff, but we can now buy from them at P France. And so let's look at what happens to the trade as a consequence of that. So the price is now reduced, ladies and gentlemen, to P France. So what's going to happen? Well, fewer of our domestic suppliers can now compete because the price is lowered. So domestic supply now shuts down a little bit, and so now domestic supply is QS France. Okay? But domestic demand, obviously because the price is lower, domestic demand goes up. And so domestic demand is QD France. Okay? That obviously means that the distance between the supply domestically and the demand domestically, that has to be met somehow, and that is going to be imported. So the distance between those two, that then becomes the amount of imports. So trade, ladies and gentlemen, as a result of joining this customs union whereby the tariff barrier is removed, trade is stimulated because now we are doing more trade with France. We didn't used to do any trade with France because there was no point, because we could produce at exactly the same price domestically as we could in terms of importing from France with a tariff. But now once we joined the customs union, the tariff is removed and we can now buy more cheaply from France. Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, point number one there is that we now have more trade with France. And point number two is that we have now moved away from buying from the most competitive producer in the world, New Zealand. It's more effective to buy from France, even though France is less efficient. And why is it more effective? Because New Zealand aren't part of the European Union, and so we'll still have to pay their tariff, which will be the common external tariff. We're going to assume that that distance between PNZ and PNZ plus T is the common external tariff. And so it makes sense to now buy from France, which is the less efficient producer. So you can see how trade is being distorted here, global trade, because as a consequence of the common external tariff, you're actually buying from a less efficient producer. Now, there are certain gains to this, obviously, buying at the French price rather than the New Zealand price along with the tariff, and they are illustrated by areas 1, 2, 3 and 4 and 5 actually. Okay, so let's consider the gains here, ladies and gentlemen. So you can see first of all that 1, 2, 3 and 4, these are all gains to the consumer because the consumer's prices drop from PNZ plus T to P France. So you know, I'm sure, that consumer welfare gains are also known as consumer surplus. And if you look at that triangle there, that is a gain in consumer surplus. That is 1, 2, 3, 4, that is a gain in consumer surplus. An area above price and below demand, I'm sure you're familiar with that. But what else is happening here, ladies and gentlemen? How are we gaining this increase in consumer surplus? Well, area 1 used to be producer surplus. Okay, because it was above supply and below price. It was in effect part of this triangle here, producer surplus. That has now, ladies and gentlemen, of course, been turned into consumer surplus. Area 3 and 5, if you take those two together, they were part of the tariff revenue because they were your quantity of imports multiplied by the tariff. Well, let's focus on Area 3 first of all. Area 3, therefore, that is no longer government revenue, that now becomes part of the consumer surplus. So that has been converted from government revenue to consumer surplus. And areas 2 and 4, well, those particular areas, they weren't going to anybody. They weren't going to any of the economic agents. Because they were part of the deadweight welfare loss of the tariff. And so those two areas, 2 and 4, have been converted from deadweight welfare losses into welfare gains for the consumer. And then lastly, ladies and gentlemen, and the last one to think about here is this area 5, which used to be part of the tariff per unit times the quantity of imports, which is the tariff revenue for the government. Well, area 5 then, ladies and gentlemen, where does that go and what is it? Well, clearly area 5 would be smaller if the French were more competitive relative to New Zealand. So if it was the case that the French price was maybe somewhere more down here, then obviously that area there would be area 3, and then that little rectangle there would be area 5. And so area 5 really is a penalty payment which is being paid by the consumer in the UK, and it's as a result of us consuming and trading with a less efficient producer, namely France. And so that will be reduced the more efficient our trading partner is. Now, whether or not joining this customs union is beneficial, well, that will all depend upon the relative efficiency of our new trading partner. Because if France is more efficient, then the relative gain in this area here, so if that was all area 3, for example, then that would be a massive chunk converted into consumer surplus, and the penalty being paid by the consumer in the UK for trading with a less efficient producer would be quite small. So the more efficient our relative trading partner is, the smaller will be area 5, and hence the larger the consumer's welfare. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that's it. I'm going to leave it at that. That is the trade creation and trade diversion effects of a customs union. Do get back to me with any questions on that. Bye for now.